Hey, welcome to Conversations, a podcast where we seek out intelligent voices, voices that have been pushed to the fringes or have been smeared or ignored. We try to understand if in fact they have valuable contributions to give, and we do this by implementing some simple principles. Participants agree on some basic rules of conversation, but most importantly, they must see the humanity in each other. At a time when polarization is only increasing, while Western civilization is at serious threat of collapse, we believe these conversations are more important now than ever before. We hope you enjoy, but most importantly, we hope you take it upon yourself to have some of these conversations. Well, let's begin. Okay, so welcome to Conversations. Today we've got Suzie Dawson with me. So hi Suzie, how you doing?
Good, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. And personally, it's a big honor for me to have you on. I think you're one of the most important journalists alive at the moment, and some of the things that you've uncovered are obviously of a very big magnitude, and because of those stories, you've had to pay a very big price. And I guess the whole theme of this podcast, of me trying to speak to people, is speaking to people that, because they've tried to report certain things or they've tried to say certain things, they've essentially had to pay a price for it, and they've been smeared or they've been pushed to the fringes. And I think with you've gone through even a lot worse than that. But just before we get things started, I've got a little mini ritual for the for the podcast, which is I just like to light a little candle at the beginning. And I think we said it on a previous conversation that we both know Rico Brower. So this idea actually came from Rico. I did his New Year's Eve podcast, and it was kind of that idea of, I think what he did it to do was, he knows that New Year's Eve there's people like Julian Assange or Chelsea Manning that essentially spend those moments alone, and so it was kind of for other people that are alone in that situation to know that there are people that are thinking about them. And I just also like the symbolism of it in terms of it's just kind of a little bit of hope in a seemingly quite a dark time. So just get going with that.
It's a beautiful offering.
Hopefully. And I guess the other part of it is that while the candle is on, it's kind of a sort of a non-written agreement that we'll kind of speak as honestly as we can and treat each other like human beings, which I don't think me and you will have any issues with, but I think it's something that's sort of lacking in debate at the moment. But okay, so just to get things started, I think hopefully a lot of people know who you are, but if someone's kind of coming to this brand new, can you sort of kind of summarize kind of how you got into the position you're in now, which we'll get into, and what kind of got you into journalism?
Sure. So my name is Suzie Dawson. I'm an activist and a journalist from Auckland, New Zealand originally. My first foray into activism was pretty much accidental. It was during the Occupy movement in 2011. And I just wanted to help people. I just wanted to be a part of it. A lot of people were saying the types of things that I'd been thinking to myself for a long time. And so I came and participated in solidarity with them. I joined the media team at the Occupation and really made some very good friends amongst my fellow media team members. And events just began to spiral of their own accord, and I found myself pretty caught up in them. I began using social media to try to advance the causes of the people at the Occupation and to share their stories. And my work was getting picked up by some pretty major international activism figures and publications. I was live tweeting events. I was working with a live streamer on my media team. running social media accounts for the occupation, and occasionally doing interviews as well. That coincided with that period in Auckland and New Zealand coincided with the FBI raid of Kim.com's mansion, where FBI agents flew into the country and participated in a 100-man raid on his property, terrorizing his wife and his children, all in the name of copyright infringement, which it turns out is not actually a crime in New Zealand. It's actually a civil issue, not a criminal issue. And that raid occurred 3 days before the then raids of the Occupy Auckland encampments in New Zealand, and a number of my colleagues and friends were arrested in those raids. My media team uncovered some pretty major and controversial stuff, which, I mean, we can get in as much detail as you want to later on, but in the wake of Occupy, I continued my activism in citizen journalism, working on a number of pretty huge movements in New Zealand, particularly the movement against the TPP, which is in our country what we knew as TPPA No Way. I spearheaded the social media side of that campaign, and also the movement against the GCSB, which is New Zealand's NSA. Basically, it's the New Zealand international spy agency that works in conjunction with the other eyes, as it's known, of the Five Eyes, which is Canada, US, UK, and Australia. Moving into 2013, 2014, I started covering events related to whistleblowers and to WikiLeaks, Snowden, etc. And in 2014, my work really began to explode when Julian Assange from WikiLeaks started to pick up on my work and to circulate it and to amplify it. And he consistently amplified my work through the period 2014 to 2018, which I'm extremely grateful for. The platform that was given to me by his promotion of my work was one that otherwise would have been denied me because of the MSM silence, the blackouts on the issues which I was covering. So WikiLeaks really blew my work wide open to an audience that otherwise I never would have had access to. And I guess in tandem to all of this is the targeting of me and others in New Zealand, a number of other people in New Zealand. So basically, as my activism and journalism increased in reach and significance, I began to experience more and more harsh methods of targeting by government agencies and private subcontracting companies. And that grew so severe that in 2015, I left New Zealand and went into exile, first in Germany, and then eventually, when the targeting of me continued, came to Russia, where I have been ever since. And through that time, I continued to work on major campaigns. 2017, I was appointed leader of the Internet Party of New Zealand, which is a registered political party founded by Kim, the tech entrepreneur Kim.com, and did a major anti-spy bill campaign with the party, drafting citizens-initiated legislation to attempt to rebalance the power between the intelligence agencies and those whom they target in the citizenry. 2018 worked on Unity for J, which is a campaign that I co-founded to try to raise support and solidarity and awareness about the situation of Julian Assange. And in 2019, last year, I launched the One versus 5i campaign to try to once again hold some of the offending agencies to account for their illegal targeting of citizens. So that's it.
Yeah,
in a
it seems like
nutshell.
you've had a pretty quiet few years then. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. And yeah, I mean, so like I mentioned, you're currently in Russia at the moment because of the some of the reporting that you've uncovered. So it'd be kind of good to go through that a little bit more in detail. So was it through I guess your experience with the Occupy movement that you started to experience the spying, and that's kind of what that kind of led you to start looking into the GCSB, and was that the sort of
So I came into Occupy just so green,
mm,
and I remember at the occupation, it never actually occurred to us because most of us, the majority of us, were first-time activists. It
mhm,
actually never occurred to us that we would be spied on, that we would be targeted. Like we couldn't even conceive of any of that happening.
mhm,
We thought to ourselves and discussed amongst ourselves that maybe there was some undercover cops there because maybe they were looking to bust some, maybe a drug dealer or, this type of thing, like maybe some petty crime. We had no cognition, no understanding that actually the state has political police forces that infiltrate mass movements and target key producers and influencers within those movements.
mhm,
So when we started to discover that we were being followed, we're being tailed by vehicles, we're being tailed on the streets. My home was broken into for the first time in December of 2011. I'd only been an activist for about 2.5 months at that point.
mhm,
um, it was really shocking to us, and we're really like, what is going on, what is happening? It felt really like Twilight Zone.
mhm,
And as it intensified, that's when we started to dig and like try and really get to the bottom of who is doing this to us, why are they doing it to us, like under what like premise are they doing it, under what legislation are they doing it. And the situation with Kim.com, I should explain a little bit. Kim is the founder of Mega Upload. Mega Upload was a Dropbox style website where people could upload content and then generate links for their friends to download that content. Mega Upload was so huge that it accounted for 4% of global internet traffic. And at the same time, it was not owned by a corporation. It wasn't owned by a Disney or, some major corporation. It was owned by just this one coder, this one hacker, this one techie, Kim.com. It
mhm,
was an independent operation, which in and of itself was a threat to the powers that be because of the size of it and how much money and power and influence was being generated, because it had such a huge user base and was so popular.
mhm,
And Kim's a serial entrepreneur. He started a number of amazing companies that are well known to people and continues to innovate to this day. But Kim was also supporting WikiLeaks,
mhm,
not just ideologically supporting them, which he did, and promoting their work, which he did, but he was also transferring large sums of money to WikiLeaks, donating to them,
mhm,
because he was so moved in particular by their 2010 reporting
mhm,
around the Iraq war logs and Afghan war diaries.
mhm,
So that painted a humongous target on him.
mhm,
And it just so happened that he was living in New Zealand, um, and that the execution of the FBI operation against him occurred within literally days of the raids of Occupy
mhm.
Auckland, that these two things converged.
Yeah.
So they raided his house on his birthday, which was January the 20th, 2012, and then threw him in jail.
Mhm,
His wife was nearly 9 months pregnant with twins at the time. And then in the course of the next couple of months, it began to come out that there was actually some really dodgy stuff going on around the targeting of him. There was illegal spying operations, there was foreign involvement, et cetera, et cetera.
mhm,
And that was when we first heard in New Zealand the news that the spy agency, which no one had really even heard of before, the GCSB, had in fact targeted 80 New Zealand citizens, at least 88 New Zealand citizens illegally. And so that was the point at which we started to go, hang on a second, Kim's being targeted by these guys, and these guys are working with the Americans. And we know at the same time, news was coming out about FBI and DHS involvement in the suppression of Occupy movement in the United States. And we started to put two and two together that, hey, these people who are targeting Occupy Wall Street, targeting Occupy Oakland, targeting occupations across America, they've actually got a hand in targeting occupiers around the world. This is an international operation, and the political targeting, as while it's being executed locally, its roots are actually offshore in the States. And so we began really digging into that and reporting on that.
And when you kind of started out, was Kim and kind of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks pretty well known to you, or was it kind of still like something that was fairly new or not even heard of at the time?
So I've been reading about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange through 2009, 2010. And I'd been sharing stuff on, like, just on my Facebook page, like, wow, this is cool, or like, here's some news, or wow, look what they've published. But it was nothing more than that. I was just observing and a reader at the time. But it was throughout this, it's really this crucial period of from the beginning of Occupy, September, October 2011 through 2012, many things happened in the infosec tech activism world within this period. And there was this real convergence of all of these issues. And so our media team started a blog called Occupy Savvy, and started blogging about not just what was happening at our own local Occupy, but what was happening at occupations all around the world. We're covering events at occupies from the Netherlands to Syria to the many in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. And we were also blogging about what was happening with Chelsea Manning, what was happening with Julian Assange, what was happening with WikiLeaks. And Occupy Savvy was a pretty huge success because there were so many Occupy supporters, and we would get 800 or 1,000 or 1,200 shares on a post, which was like a really big deal to us at that time. We were outperforming New Zealand mainstream media by 100-fold, and we were very lucky to have like I said, some high profile supporters around the world amplifying that work. But it was going from the news style blogging into the longer investigative journalism style pieces where we started to really look into things more deeply and report on them more fully. That was a clear transition in the work. Absolutely.
And so just kind of talk about some of those early stuff. So what kind of things did you uncover about the New Zealand spy agencies? I mean, was it just who they were? And
so the first major discovery for us was we were filming at the two evictions. So Kim's house was raided on the Friday night on the 20th, and then Occupy Auckland, which had 4 different occupation sites that we'd set up that were running simultaneously. All 4 occupations were raided on the Monday morning on the 23rd of January 2012. And we were there covering that live. I think there was 42 arrests on that day. It was like mass arrests. It was a big deal for us. And then again, 2 days later, it must have been 3 days because it's 23rd and 26th. So then the Thursday, because we'd reoccupied, so they came and did a second raid of all of the occupation sites. And when we were recording live footage of the mass arrests, one of the members of our media team put 2 and 2 together and realized that multiple, I think it was 4 different police officers had exactly the same identification badges on their uniforms with the same serial number, which is totally illegal in New Zealand. Like, each officer is supposed to have an identifying badge number that is unique to them. And so these cops had these replica uniforms and replica badge numbers. And we actually managed to capture photographs and live footage of this. And we managed to break the story into the New Zealand mainstream media, and it was covered nationwide. And so the New Zealand police were outed for this. And what we realized pretty quickly was that those cops weren't cops. Those the FBI had come into the country to do the raid on Kim.com, and they had stayed to do the raids on Occupy Auckland, which is completely illegal. Like this is the police and law enforcement officials from a foreign country running a domestic operation in New Zealand. This is like totally not okay. But that's what they're doing. And sure enough, after the second raid that Thursday, then on the Friday, the media reported that the FBI had left the country. So that was our first big, real major scoop in that regard. And the first instance of us actually being able to break a story nationwide into the mainstream press. So the police lied their asses off all the way through about it. They said they're going to launch first they said, oh, this is terrible, we're going to launch an investigation, blah, blah, blah. And then they said absolutely nothing about it for a year. And then after a year, they said, oh, we've decided to drop the investigation because we don't have enough resources. But we've spoken to the officers involved and they've been reprimanded. So it's like just whatever. They also, they actually said that it was the actions of rogue officers. And it's like, hang on a second. So rogue officers are going to somehow manufacture like flawless replicas of official police badges. Like this is like nonsensical. Like how is a rogue police officer going to manage to manufacture like police standard identification like badges? But they just deflected and deflected for as long as they could, and then they dropped the investigation, which is a pattern that has continued throughout the years in New Zealand as more and more information and evidence about what was happening has come to light. We've seen exactly the same thing happen. So
yeah, what was the kind of public's reaction in terms of how did people? Was it did it cause a big stir, or was it?
Well, I was quite amazed that the media actually covered it, and I think like several major outlets in New Zealand covered it, both in video broadcast media and also in print. I can't really, it's difficult for me to gauge the public reaction. People seem to be like fairly outraged about it. And New Zealand is actually quite a I consider it to be quite a like civically minded, activism friendly country, in the sense that we really pride ourselves on our activism history. So, we're the first country to give women the vote. We're the first country to legalize homosexuality. We had in the 80s humongous, massive protest movements, anti-apartheid, anti-racism, anti-nuclear. The Free Mandela movement had a humongously important wing in New Zealand. There's this real heritage of activism in New Zealand that even the average New Zealander is aware of and feels a sense of pride about. So I think that generally speaking, the public, when they do learn about these things going on, are pretty affronted by it. And they're pretty unhappy about it. But actually translating that public discontent into tangible effect in the political sphere is very difficult and another story entirely.
Yeah, and well, I was going to take it down a different route, but I'll leave that for now. And then, so from there, I guess you started focusing on this issue more, and that's what kind of led you to uncover the Five Eyes, and well, I guess that was through the Snowden or the documents that Snowden had got, or were you able to get those by yourself? Can you sort of talk about
there was growing awareness in 2012 and the end of 2011 and 2012 amongst the infosec/tech activist community about the pervasiveness of surveillance and the potential for mass surveillance to be occurring. If you go back and watch Julian Assange's the World Tomorrow series and Cypherpunk's episodes in particular, You see these discussions between Jeremy Zimmerman and Jake Applebaum and Julian Assange where these types of issues are raised. So there was that, but at the same time, there also was a series of leaks that were coming out, particularly the Strap for Intelligence hack, known as the GI files, that also alluded to this type of ubiquitous surveillance that maybe we began to suspect. We began to suspect that mass surveillance was occurring, and there began to be like the first shreds of evidence coming out. An anonymous operation unearthed specifically pertaining to New Zealand information about a company called SSI Pacific Corp in Wellington in New Zealand, which was a lawful intercept company, which is like this euphemism for corporate private sector mass surveillance. They have the same type of tools as law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies, but they shop them out on the corporate market to customers. And so we began to look into that aspect of it. And at the same time, Kim's case was moving through the courts and was unearthing all types of information about the operation of GCSB equipment being used against private citizens in New Zealand. And this unknown, because we've never been able to, I think we know for sure who 4 of the 88 people are that the GCSB targeted in New Zealand. You've got to understand, when they target one person, that draws in thousands into the dragnet, because they go what Bill Binney, ex-NSA technical director, calls 2 hops. And so they go every person that the target knows or communicates with, and every person that they know or communicate with. So when I say 88 targets, I mean this could impact like large sector of my country with only 4.5 million people in it. And those are the 88 targets that they've admitted that they illegally targeted. God knows how many there actually were. So we began to dig more and more and more into these issues, the issues of the privatization of intelligence functions, the intelligence agencies hiring these subcontracting private sector agencies to perpetuate surveillance against New Zealanders. We found out from FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests from the Auckland Council, that they had hired a private intelligence company, a private security and surveillance company called Thompson Clark Investigations Limited, and paid them megabucks to target occupiers. And so that was our first solid evidence. Well, it was our first ability to take what we were experiencing and what we were seeing and witnessing around us and what we were going through, and tie it to actual documents and contracts and company names, and start to have some real sense of like what the roots of this were. And then as we dug more and more into that, we started to understand that the tendrils of the spying and surveillance extended across society and across borders internationally. And that there really were several moments, there was particularly definitive moments for me, where I actually started to realize, like, they're not just spying on activists. They're not just spying on, like, at first I was shocked that they were spying on activists and journalists, but then I started to realize, like, this is an architecture, this is an infrastructure, and a for-profit motive has been introduced to it. And when you add a for-profit motive to spying, you need more targets, because more targets means more employees, means more contracts, means more money, means more funding, means growth. The growth, the eternal profit mantra of surveillance capitalism means they need to grow, and the only way they can grow is more targets, more cameras, more spying. And that was when I started to realize, like, this really is going to ultimately impact everybody. It's going to spread throughout society. And there's a interview that I did in April of 2012. And in that interview, I talked about all of these aspects. I talked about Thompson Clark Investigations Limited, the subcontractor that had been spying on us. I talked about the profit motive of the privatization of intelligence functions. And I specifically talked about the way that the methods by which they can penetrate our communications. And in that interview, I talked about your cell phone can be used as a microphone. They can access the emails on your phone. They can access the files and photographs on your phone. They can, and I just like literally systematically went through all of the methods that were being used to penetrate the communications of targets and of the people who know people that aren't even targets but are within this two concentric rings of separation from targets. And so that seemed like really prescient, but actually it was the product of the combination of what I was personally experiencing and seeing and witnessing, and the information that I was discovering from my research and from the wider tech activism community amalgamated together into that. The relevance of Snowden, and he says it himself, the relevance of Snowden is that he took what we were witnessing and seeing and what we were researching and suspecting and gave us the hard evidence for it. He gave us, here is the PowerPoint presentations where they've plotted out how they're going to do this to you, and then they've gone ahead and employed that. And he just completely laid that open. And so it took it from we're seeing this and we're thinking this and we're reading this to it's here, it's happened, here's the details, here's the fine print, here's exactly who's doing it, how they're doing it, and who they're doing it to. So that was why that was a really big deal. So in 2012, when I decided that I was going to full-time apply myself 24/7 to taking on the GCSB in New Zealand, because I wanted to make sure that they couldn't do this to everybody. And so we began the GCSB movement, which over the course of the following year became a humongous nationwide movement, drew in dozens of towns and cities in New Zealand, and again broke into the mainstream in a really big way. It took 8 to 10 months of concerted effort, but then we got to the point where the 7 p.m. current affairs news shows were every night of the week talking about the GCSB, mass surveillance, spying on New Zealanders, and the GCSB became part of the public lexicon, to the extent that even people who weren't politically engaged were talking to each other about these issues and were in opposition to mass surveillance. So that was really yet another huge transition.
And at what point did you start experiencing being targeted by surveillance and intelligence community people?
So the targeting of me it started off like slowly and low level, and it just as my, like I said, as my significance and reach increased, as my audience increased and my activity increased, and as I made more and more connections with other known targets and other targeted organizations, it accelerated over time and the seriousness of it increased. So, and my very, very first awareness was people following me to and from meetings at the occupation, following me in vehicles, following me on foot. And not just myself, and my entire media team was experiencing this. So there was like a number of us that were being subjected to this type of thing. And there was constant sabotage of initiatives within the activism group, within the Occupy. There was clear targeting and smearing of anybody who was like producing really good work. So like they went after our media team coordinator, they went after our best facilitator, they went after several people on media team before they actually got to me and went after me. So I was kind of like about like 4th or 5th down the list of people who were getting the treatment. So by the time I got it, I'd seen what was happening to other good people, and I was kind of like, oh, okay, well, this is somewhat of a compliment. December, like I said, the middle of December, they broke into my house for the first time, and that was like where it kind of went up a level, because they smashed a window from the inside of my house. I came home, window was smashed, but it was smashed from the inside of the house, not from the outside of the house. Nothing was stolen, I mean, in retrospect, I assume that they were like planting like bugs or whatever it is that they do when they like enter for the first time. But it was in 2012 that then like weird, creepy things started to happen. So that was when like I would come home and items would be inside my house that weren't there beforehand. And there was no other adults there, to leave items there, or my belongings were tampered with, or they just would leave very obvious signs, like so that I would know they'd been inside my house. But it was always done in ways which are virtually impossible to prove. And then in the later part of 2012, I started to make FOIA requests of the New Zealand police about their various activities, and my journalism work was being routinely published on Occupy Oakland's media team blog in California in the United States, and they were the second largest occupation in the world. So that obviously pushed me up the shit list a bit as well. And that was when I started getting like my first wave of really concerted smear campaigns. So I had an ex-police prosecutor turned private investigator target me and smear me, and that person like would take photos of my car and my house and publish them all over the internet, publish blog sites about me, make completely ridiculous false allegations about me, put posts on public pages like making reference to my children and like personal information, and just endangering and attacking me. In retrospect, that stuff still seems kind of low level to me, though it's probably quite scary to other people. And certainly at the time, it was really like, why is this person doing this to me? What's going on? And I naively actually went to the police, and I was like, I'm a single mother. This person's publishing details about my underage children. Like, please, can you do something about this? And the police actually literally looked me in the face and said, as long as you're an activist, this is going to happen to you. And that, for me, that was a real wake-up moment. For me, that was like, oh my God, are you kidding me? Like, you're literally telling me you're not going to protect my kids. You're not going to protect me. You're not going to take any action about this. You're just going to say, because I'm an activist, that it's cool that I can be stalked and smeared and my kids endangered, and like that, you're not going to do anything about it. So that was another like, oh wow, okay, the state really, ultimately the state is behind this, and therefore the state is not going to take any action to provide you with any security or justice.
Yeah. And so, but you're saying you kind of managed to get on a lot of mainstream media and, got a decent amount of attention while this was happening. I guess, well, I was trying to think, why do you think, despite the media attention that you got and stuff, that, there wasn't any kind of public outcry about, this type of things that you experienced, or did you kind of keep it fairly?
Well, so the thing is that during this time, like especially me, like as a solo mom, like I wasn't like publishing under my real name. I was just publishing under a pseudonym, under a handle, my Twitter handle. And all of the members of my media team were doing the same thing. Like we were just known by our Twitter handles, and like I didn't even have a profile picture of myself. I had like the logo for the Occupy was for Occupy New Zealand was my profile picture on my Twitter account for years. And when I published everything, all my publishing, my blog posts, my live event coverage, everything was all pseudonymous. And I also really shied away from interviews. I would only do interviews at like really critical moments, like there's been a raid of the Occupy, okay, I'll consent to do an interview. But I wasn't trying to be known in media. I actually did every goddamn thing I could to not have a public profile. And I guess that's why like that first smear campaign was all about like identifying me, like this is her name, this is her address, doxing me, this is her phone number, this is how old her kids are, like it was about that, trying to force me against my will and without my consent to be publicly named and scrutinised, even though for my kids' sake and for my family's sake, I'd very much tried not to be. Now, eventually, as the targeting, so we're into 2013 and the GCSB movement is huge. There's 50,000 tweets on the hashtag. There's actions all over the country. We're trying to stop the GCSB bill, which is a piece of legislation that was introduced to do two things. One, to retroactively immunise the agencies for the illegal spying that they'd already been doing to citizens, and two, to legalise mass surveillance going forward. Because the GCSB were supposed to, according to their charter, only target foreign citizens. They weren't supposed to, or foreigners, they were not supposed to target New Zealand citizens or permanent residents. And lo and behold, that's what they've been doing. Now, we got so goddamn close with that movement that the vote for the GCSB bill, we lost by one vote in Parliament. We were that close to shutting down that piece of legislation. But they managed to pass it through. They managed to shove it through. And when they did, that piece of legislation morphed into the UK IP bill, the Aussie Data Retention Act, the USA Freedom Act, and the Canada C51 changes. So it's yet another recurring pattern that you see when you look at security legislation in Western nations, is that these, once it passes somewhere, it gets replicated, and almost identical versions of the legislation are just rolled out across the Western world. And so that is why that fight was so important to us, and it was really upsetting that we lost it, because we did have the success of breaking through into the public consciousness nationwide, which in itself was a huge accomplishment. But we just narrowly missed actually preventing the legislation from passing. And so during that time period, this is also in tandem to Snowden coming forward and Snowden revelations, et cetera. And that was where in 2013 the targeting of me became even more aggressive. I started to have my car tires slashed. I was getting overt threats. I was having infiltration attempts into my life by human intelligence. There was little operations trying to entrap me into crimes, all types of things. So it was kind of like the next step up from what I had been experiencing previously. And then in 2014, that's when I began supporting Internet Party. Kim.com formed the Internet Party and was contesting the New Zealand election. And that was a highly contentious election in New Zealand. It was very, very high stakes for a number of reasons. And Kim, as part of the campaign, hosted a humongous event called the Moment of Truth, which featured Edward Snowden, Glenn Greenwald, Kim, Julian, Assange, all live at the Auckland Town Hall. And I was involved in promoting that event. And the lead up to that event and other surrounding things that were happening, the targeting of me went up a notch again. And that's where I started to experience seriously life-endangering targeting. And that was when things got really, really downright scary. Really, like, next level beyond scary. For example, people trying to push me off the road, boxing me in with vehicles, or really actually life-endangering stuff. My oil cap being removed and my car catching on fire while it's moving, and these types of really messed up stuff. Which, as a single mother who the police have told, too bad, we're not going to do anything about this, was downright petrifying and dangerous, really dangerous. And just to summarize, to get to the point of going into exile, then a week after the Moment of Truth event with Snowden, Greenwald, and Julian, Assange, and Kim.com, the government, who had been involved in all of this targeting and everything I've described up to this point, was re-elected. And immediately upon their re-election, I started to get serious death threats, serious credible. They were literally saying to me, "Leave the country or you are dead." And that was when, and I was staring 3 years, because the New Zealand electoral cycle is 3 years. I was staring like 3 years of these like tyrants being in power again, and thinking literally like, what are my chances of surviving this? Like, it's a miracle that I made it through this far.
What form did they come in? Was it like in messages, or?
I would have, they would, what I call bunny hop my login. So like I would log into YouTube, and I would get this like Google Plus notification with this like profile picture of a serial killer. It'd be like, from some horror movie, and they would like and I'd get these messages, and then I'd like log out of that, and I'd log into Twitter, and I'd get some like account with like just one eye as the profile picture, which would repeat the threat, and then I'd log out of that, and I'd log into email, and then I'd get an email message. It was like they knew what I was logging into when I was logging into it, and then I would get these like replicated messages from these accounts, and then the accounts would vanish, like they'd be gone after that, and it's never like, Suzie Dawson, we are going to kill you, we are from the government. It's not like this. Like they don't leave like a clear evidence. They're all about it's like I was saying about when they'd break into my house. Like they would break into my house and do the most ridiculous petty things that, like, if I try and explain to people, they've left an open newspaper on my, like, I've gone out of the house, there's no newspaper on my table. I come back in, there's a newspaper open, and it's an article about Len Brown, who I'd just been doing a Facebook post about. Len Brown, then Mayor of Auckland, etc. So they would leave things that I would understand the significance of immediately,
right?
And they'd leave it in my personal spaces to let me know they've been in my personal, they have access to my bedroom, they have access to, there's nowhere that I can go that they can't get to. And it's virtually, at the time, I mean, I'm in a very different position now in terms of proving that these things have happened to me, because there's been actual official reports into it that this has all been verified now, that this kind of targeting has been occurring, and that the very people that I said were involved in it were in fact involved in it. So in 2020, I'm in a much different position. But in 2013 and 2014, as the single mother, having these things happen to you, and having the police already say, we don't care and we're not going to do anything about it, it was virtually impossible to try to prove it in a way that you could actually build enough public support to try to get some redress. It was just like an insurmountable challenge. And so my options very much felt like either I stay and I keep having strange vehicles box me in and try and run me off the road, and God knows what else they come up with next, or I sell everything, pack up and go. And so that was what I did.
Yeah, and I guess this is one of the things that I think makes you so admirable, is that you obviously did face a kind of concerted effort to pretty much shut you up and keep you quiet, which you obviously haven't done as you're sitting there in Russia. But I mean, kind of, did you sort of debate or whether you should be doing this anymore, or was it kind of a fairly straightforward thing for you of, this is just the right thing to do and I need to keep going regardless of, just kind of, what was your thought process of, did you debate continuing or carrying on the journalism?
So
maybe I should just keep quiet or whatever.
So my thinking on that really evolved over time. So like initially at Occupy, when people started referring to me as being an activist, I was like almost offended, like, because I didn't really understand what an activist was. I just wanted to help people and support people. I just wanted to do whatever I could to help spread the message, and I wasn't trying to be something. I wasn't trying to like, okay, now I'm going to take on this role. I'm going to have the title activist. This was never in my thinking. So I went through initially a period of almost resentment because I'd be like, I didn't choose to be an activist. I didn't want to, but like, I never said, hey, I think I'd like to be an activist. Like, this is not it. And so when people would start to be like, oh, well, you're an activist and therefore these strange things are happening, I'd kind of be like, I didn't pick this. Why is this happening to me? Like, I didn't choose this. So that was like my initial like reaction was just like, I just want to help people. I should be able to help people. And there shouldn't be any decision on my part. I mean, how am I going to be like, oh, no, I'm not going to help people? Of course I'm going to help people. Like, this is like what everybody should be doing. You shouldn't have to be deemed an activist to do it. I was taking people food and I was trying to spread their messages and I was trying to just support what they were doing, which was really positive civic engagement. They weren't trying to blow something up. They weren't trying to start a war. They were just trying to better the situations of the average citizen, the average person. So that was it. And then once all these things started happening to us and we went through discovering the fake cops and then learning about the GCSB and the surveillance and stuff, I do remember I was sitting at my computer at the back of the house and I was thinking about like, I was actually considering to myself, like, should I start this #GCSB hashtag and just push this 24/7 and make every goddamn person in this country know about what the GCSB's done? And then I thought to myself, like, what will happen to me if I do that? And I thought, okay, like, they're spies, like, they will probably kill me. I actually thought to myself, they'll probably kill me. And then I thought, well, this is literally something that affects every single person in my country. And one of the things that particularly actually mentally was like driving me over the edge is I knew that it wasn't just me that they were spying on. They were spying on my kids, like my minor children, by spying on me, by listening to my cell phone, by like monitoring my house, by breaking into my house. They were spying on my babies, on my kids. And that means they were spying on other people's kids too. And that means they were spying on other mothers and other single mothers and other people on my media team. They were students, they were grandmothers. This was happening to them. And so I literally, when I thought, oh, they'll probably, maybe I'll probably be killed for this. Like, this is probably what will happen. Then I just thought to myself, like, literally I thought, well, I better make as much fucking noise as I can before that happens. I better do a good job and make sure that every person in this country knows what they've been doing. I'll do as much awareness raising as I can before anything like that happens. That was my thought process. I never did I think to myself, I'll just sit down and be quiet and just live in a world where this happens. Who wants to live in a world where that happens?
Yeah.
Like, to me, this is nonsensical. I can't actually understand that anyone would want to live in a world where that happens.
Yeah.
And if you know that something like this is happening, you have an obligation. You have an obligation. They had no right to target me. I'm non-violent, no history of violence, no criminal record, mother of 2 kids in the suburbs. They had no right to take military-grade surveillance technology and terrorism legislation and terrorism funding and target me with it. And that like righteous indignation that I feel about how egregious it was that they did that, that has never faded in all these years. And each time that they did something else to me, like each incident that kept happening, incident after incident, just validated for me over and over again. These people have to be stopped.
Yeah.
Like, they have to be stopped. And they won't be stopped by me going, oh, I better just sit down and be quiet and do nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not going to stop them. That's going to empower them. That's going to create a payoff for them.
Yeah. And I think we kind of alluded to this a little bit, but it'd be kind of interesting for you to kind of tie it up. You kind of mentioned of how what happens in New Zealand is kind of the same as what happens across the Five Eyes, and we've talked about that a little bit before. But can you maybe sort of just explain of kind of in a bit more detail how that takes place, or under kind of what mechanisms, or how that all manifests itself?
Sure. So I would recommend that if people are interested in this, that they go and have a look at my body of work, particularly my writings over the last 2 years. Over the last 2 years, rather than just writing massive, really huge, long research pieces like I had before,
Hmm.
I've started to take the knowledge that I have gained from studying WikiLeaks files and Snowden documents and all these various different sources,
Hmm.
and to try to put them into a graphical format that people can easily understand.
Hmm.
Try to put them into my own slides. Like the NSA has slides of like their architecture. I have like little slides that I've made for like trying to make it easy to understand for the average person, what's happening. Um, but it really is like there is this one of the questions I always get asked by people is like, were the CIA targeting you in New Zealand? Like, do you
Yeah.
have like CIA officers like running around after you? And I try and explain to them that's not how it works. Like the CIA doesn't need to have like men in black like breaking into your house or walking around the street
Mm.
following you. This isn't how it works because the CIA is a customer of the NSA. That means the NSA spies on people electronically and then gives that information to the CIA.
Mm.
The NSA has top level database access and from the pipe cable access to all of the digital communications of the world, or damn near close to all of the digital communications in the world.
Mm.
That means that they have New Zealand from the cable digital information. I mean, Snowden talked about being able to sit at his desk, and if he wanted to target a New Zealander or to get information from New Zealand, he just had to tick the checkbox which said New Zealand.
Mm.
That's how simple it was for him.
Mm.
Um, and so this means that they have like the communications from like New Zealand police agencies, from New Zealand law enforcement agencies, which means they have the data from the private intelligence and private investigation subcontractors who are hired by the New Zealand police and by law enforcement and intelligence agencies in New Zealand. So when that subcontracting agency goes and hires some chump to follow me down the street, and that chump then goes and files his little report to the private investigation company, which files their report to the private intelligence agency, which files their report to the New Zealand police or New Zealand SIS, Security Intelligence Services, who files their report, and it just goes up, 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 up. So if the CIA want to watch you, they don't actually have to send somebody to watch you. All of the information that is gathered by all of these really low level people, these low level investigators, the random like people photographing me everywhere I went in New Zealand
Mm.
and in Germany, is available to those agencies if they want it.
Mm.
So it's like a reverse. I've described it many times as being like a reverse waterfall. It's like the data is coming from the ground and it's going up, and it's going up to those who have the top level access to it.
Mm.
Then you have in the middle of that chain, you've got the fusion centers, and the fusion centers are basically um, wholesaling data between public and private sector. So they are taking uh, information from government departments, military information, police information, corporate information, open source information that's in the public arena, and fusing it all together. And then they're serving both corporate and clients and governmental and clients, and those are international governments as well as their own national government. So it really is like this big data pie that everybody, all of these entities have their fingers in any given day of the week.
Mm. And then I guess through your work, we've mentioned that you've kind of become quite close to Julian Assange. So kind of maybe just very generally to start off with, I mean, what do you think, why do you think he's such an important person, and especially, I guess, in this kind of landscape, you know, what do you think people should understand about him that's not particularly well understood?
That's a big topic. So that's a big topic for me.
Yeah.
So I think that everybody who knows Julian feels about him differently in the context of how they know him and their experiences of him. They like him for different reasons, appreciate him for different reasons. And then there's the obvious big reasons, right? The guy published war crimes. That's huge. It's historic. It's incredibly significant and important. And it's almost unique in the modern media environment. To me personally, what Julian meant to me personally when I was in New Zealand, that, and I wasn't directly communicating with him at that time, but he was sharing my work. Julian meant to me at that time that a media which was not just a media at the behest of a government that was conspiring to run a containment strategy on my work and my reporting. Because what was happening is I was reporting things about very key political events and very key political people that was completely contrary to the establishment narrative that they were trying to push through the channels. And when Julian would take his 3 million followers and spread my first person testimonies of what was actually happening on the ground, that just completely changed the conversation and the narrative in New Zealand and my own visibility in New Zealand. And I credit actually with keeping me alive at that point, because the visibility that he gave me in doing that definitely made it harder. I mean, part of the reason they want to contain my work is not just to stop the public knowing the truth, but also to prevent me gaining any type of profile or credibility where I could have any safety or security in a situation where they were covertly targeting me. So that's one of the first most major reasons that I respect Julian, is his interventions in saving the lives of at-risk journalists and publishers. And there's a long history of that. Julian, throughout his career, consistently intervened and advocated for, attempted to provide protection and security and assistance to whistleblowers, but also particularly to journalists and to publishers who he felt were of significance. And there is a number of journalists and publishers for whom Julian's intervention made a material difference in the outcomes of these situations. People know about Snowden, but Snowden's not a journalist or a publisher. I'm talking about Amin Husseinov, who Julian essentially rescued from Azerbaijan and got to Switzerland and got asylum for. And
what was that? Sorry?
Amin Husseinov was a
yeah, sorry.
Who literally the outcome of his life and his situation was completely transformed by Julian's involvement. And I just can't think of anybody else who's doing that. Who is doing that? There are entire NGOs and agencies that have been unable to do that, even though that's in their charter and they have resources, and I certainly hope that those agencies and NGOs will be able to take a leaf out of Julian's book and actively stage those types of interventions, because it is so necessary. It is so necessary that that there is a lifeline and a safety net for people who risk paying the ultimate price for the public interest and the public good.
I think that point is really kind of an amazing point to raise, because I think the way that Julian is portrayed in the media, or maybe people's perception of him, is that he's kind of this maybe slightly arrogant and kind of self-centered person that likes to be in front of the cameras, and he wants to make a big controversy. But I think when you actually kind of look at his history, and I've been obviously researching for the last couple of weeks about peace, and you'll know a lot more about this than I do, but when you kind of look at his background, he's been someone that has very consistently stood up for journalists, but also just throughout everything that he's done, he's always been about kind of transparency, democracy, improving people's access to information and things like that. And so much of that gets kind of missed out when we talk about him now. It's he's just this this guy who skipped bail to run away from rape charges. Obviously, we both will feel the same way about that in terms of how ridiculous all that is. So I'm glad that you kind of mentioned how he's been someone that to stand up for journalists, and obviously I think we talked about this a little bit last time with you, but he obviously I think he's done a lot to help you out personally.
So just to summarize that last point, WikiLeaks saves lives. And it's interesting because the government narrative is, oh, they endangered, whoever, wherever. We can't actually tell you who they endangered or when, how, or where. But the truth is that WikiLeaks saves lives, and the truth is that Julian Assange saves lives. And I think Elizabeth Leah-Voss dug up that 40,000 court cases in the world had utilised WikiLeaks documents to prove the merit of their case. And I mean, that type of scale and influence is just like unheard of, and almost impossible to really grasp and grip the net significance of that. And that's personally, that's one of the reasons that I admire Julian so much, is because he couldn't sit by and watch people being targeted by the state and say nothing. And he could, even more than, it isn't even just that he'd speak up for us, it isn't even just that he'd advocate for us, he would intervene. He would intervene. He would do whatever he could to change the outcome of the situation and act. And that to me is that is one of the things that I love the most about him, is that willingness to act. Another thing that I respect so much about Julian is that he did not give a shit what people would think. He would act on principle and according to his own ethical requirements and ethical guidelines. And even if he knew that it was in detriment to his own position. See, many times I have known that if I do this, if I do that, it's going to put me in even worse shit than I'm already in. It's going to make my life harder than it already is. But it was so important to do it that I couldn't. It almost like your considerations of yourself, your own situation, are superfluous by comparison to the critical nature of what it is that that needs to be done. And you know that it needs to be done, you know how to do it, and you know that you can do it, and so therefore you must do it. I see the same thing with Julian over and over again. Like his advocacy for Catalonia is just like one of the more recent examples. He knew that was going to get him in this shit. He knew it was going to hack off Spain. He knew it was going to hack off Ecuador. But he also knew that there are millions of people who are literally being beaten and gassed by riot police, and they're just trying to have a vote. They're just trying to have a say and have self-determination. And so he put himself at risk yet over and over. I mean, he was already so at risk, and he put himself at risk again and again and again and again. And that ties into something else. And Caitlin Johnson, if you get to see this interview, you'll like what I'm about to say. Caitlin is a friend of mine. She's all about narrative. Okay, This is one of the things that I love the most about Julian. Julian wasn't subject to narrative. Julian drove narrative. Julian knew how to, I shouldn't be using past tense, it's not fair to him. Julian knows how to seize the narrative and seize the conversation from governments, from media. He knows how to set an agenda and put his own righteous agenda, and push it in such a way that they cannot fail to heed it. And Julian would set that narrative, he would set that direction, and he would so forcefully push it that everybody else would jump on board. Ultimately, first, the public and the support base, but ultimately even the media and even governments. And what that does is it pushes those in power into a reactive position. It means that Julian and WikiLeaks held the proactive position, and they held the control of the global conversation, the narrative across the Western world. I mean, this is, again, it's unprecedented, it's unheard of. And they were forced to chase after him, and they were forced to counter his narratives, and they were forced to try and deal with what he was doing in his situation. That's just I mean, who else has been able to do that? Who else really has understood how to do that? And to do it at repeated gross personal risk
Mm-hmm.
to himself,
Yeah.
but gain for millions of people, gain
Mm-hmm.
for humanity as a whole and society as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
That's the next reason that I love Julian.
Mm-hmm.
Julian said to me, and Julian and I didn't have a deeply personal relationship. We were very much professional. I mean, we talked like friends, but um, Julian trusted me because of my work, or trusts me because of my work. The greatest compliment he ever paid to me, and I think if I could summarize why he liked me, he said, "You write about intelligence agencies."
That was it.
That's what he said to me. You write about intelligence agencies, he said to me. And in those simple words, I realized, aha, this is why he's watching Decipher You episodes of me analyzing Snowden files online. This is why he's circulating my work, is because of natural causes, because of the experiences that I had.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, my work did absolutely center around exposing intelligence agencies.
Mm-hmm.
And in the course of Julian's experience and Julian's work,
Mm-hmm.
his did as well,
Mm-hmm.
because he was being targeted by intelligence agencies for legitimate publishing and journalistic activities. He was made to feel the fire, and still is to this day, by them. And he was likewise investigating them. He was exposing them, exposing their methods. I mean, for all of the Snowden documents that we've studied online, there are God knows how many manuals, US Army manuals, intelligence agency manuals, published by WikiLeaks. There are millions of documents published by WikiLeaks that are relevant to my field of interest and my field of journalism.
Mm-hmm.
And I really did take that as the greatest compliment when he said that you write about intelligence agencies, because what he was saying is, this is a rare thing.
Mm-hmm.
There are, for all the journalists in the world, how many of those journalists write about intelligence agencies
Yeah.
specifically?
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's like a relatively small number.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so if that was, for me, it was a very crystalline expression of his interest in me, or what intrigued him about me. What
Mm-hmm.
intrigued him about me was the focus of my work and the focus of my journalism.
Mm-hmm.
And in his consumption of my journalism, he was obviously seeing impressions of his own. And that for me is just huge compliment.
Mm-hmm.
Much better compliment than any other compliment I could think of that someone could give me. That was actually the greatest compliment.
Yeah, of course. And I guess in a similar way to you also, he's been obviously smeared, I would say, and I think you've written about this, but the sort of the rape allegations that the charges that were dropped, but I mean, you've reported on this for people that kind of don't have sort of a clear understanding of what took place. Can you sort of give people a summary of why, how did those charges come about and why they're not to be taken seriously?
Well, ultimately, after years, they never actually came up with any charges. He was never, ever charged with rape or with sexual
Mm-hmm.
assault. The investigations, multiple investigations, which did not produce any rape charges in any instance, were repeatedly dropped. There were hundreds of anomalies with the way that they were conducted, who they were conducted by. It was dragged out over nearly, the better part of a decade, to the detriment of any potential complainants, as well as the detriment of Julian, and certainly the detriment of justice as a whole. However, it's good. There are a couple of things that have to be said. One is that in the GI files, they actually had and actually they're separate too. There was leaked emails from GCHQ where they were bragging about what happened to Julian in Sweden being a fit up, in their words, a stitch up. It was designed to entrap him. And prior to it, there was other private intelligence employees saying let's honey trap him, let's do this to him, let's blah blah blah. And I think what frustrates me is that period of time in Sweden gets treated in isolation, as if like Julian was on some kind of like holiday or off on a lark in Sweden and had these affairs and blah 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 blah. That's not at all accurate as to what was actually going on. In that same week, the Pentagon had already launched a manhunt, had already named him as being subject to a manhunt. Half a dozen to a dozen other US agencies were already announcing their own investigations and getting involved. They had already been in talks with the Australians to try to revoke his passport. In that same week, his credit cards and debit cards were cancelled, and he was actually stranded in Sweden with no access to funds at the time at which these women appeared in his life. There was a whole bunch of surrounding circumstances. But the more broad picture now, with the benefit of hindsight, when we actually take a step back and zoom out, is not just whatever happened with Julian in Sweden, but actually a bigger picture of the politicization of accusations of rape and sexual assault, and experiences or alleged experiences of rape and sexual assault. Because we have now, and I wrote about this in a piece last year called Freeing Julian Assange Part 1, which is on contraspin.co.nz, which is one of my websites. In that investigation, I went into great detail about this, and I discovered that actually it was not just Julian in WikiLeaks who was accused of rape and sexual assault. There was actually 4 members of WikiLeaks, 4 men involved with WikiLeaks, who have been accused of abuse of women. And in each of those cases, there are spurious claims. There's a whole methodology that I detail in the article, replete with little graphs to help people understand it. This same methodology has been systematically, very cunningly and systematically rolled out again and again and again to neutralize political targets within WikiLeaks, to damage and destroy their reputation. And I, as a woman and as a survivor, am hugely offended and affronted that our experiences could be weaponized by intelligence agencies and by governments under this guise of caring about women or caring about survivors, that they would so abuse us as to weaponize these allegations in order to achieve political means. I think it's absolutely despicable and disgusting, and very telling about the true nature of government and these agencies, that they're willing to do this, and that they continue to perpetuate it, that they see it as a strategy, as a means to an end, in total ignorance of the desecration of real survivors that happens every day. Because real survivors do not get top shelf first class treatment by police. We do not get international decade long investigations by series of prosecutors. We do not get global media publicizing our accusations before the suspect has even been questioned. We do not get any of the treatment that is on display in these cases. Far from it. We get abused by the police agencies and by the process of the complaints. We get 5% conviction rate. We get, 90. We get so many women not even wanting to report in the first place because the process is so abusive, and just the entire way that the case against Julian was handled is indicative of political motivations and nothing whatsoever to do with preserving the rights of women or attempting to achieve actual justice.
I was just watching the Laura Poitras film Risk, just trying to do some research, and you see a scene of Julian with his 2 lawyers. I don't know if you've seen that film.
I have.
Yeah, of course. And he's and they're telling him of what to say and what language he should use to, I guess, to 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 show that he's not distasteful to women or whatever. But you can sort of see him, in a typical Julian way of just kind of very clearly in sort of 2 sentences, just kind of cut through all of it to say, I'm not doing that because this is clearly, even if it was, I don't argue that it was in his best interest to follow the advice of that particular lawyer, but I just thought it was interesting how even in that situation he was kind of insistent on he's not fudging his principles to kind of satisfy a jury or the lawyers in terms of these issues. I did have a specific point with that.
Oh, look, I'd love to blow that to smithereens if I can.
Oh, please.
Allow me. Okay, because that was a much reported on scene. I mean, from the Hollywood Reporter to all kinds of different publications.
I think it got
made a big song and a dance about that. It was supposed to show, how Julian is crass and uncouth and uncaring about women. And
he's actually. I think he's much more. What he says is a lot more honest than people realize. I think.
Julian absolutely has the ability to take 4,000 words and stick them into 8 words.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have a conversation with him, I mean, sometimes I was literally just amazed at his ability to create really high impact, really well thought out, articulate sentences out of what would have taken me, an hour to explain. However, in that particular scene, I don't see a man being offensive to women. I don't see a man being callous or uncaring to women. What I see is an Aussie bloke, a guy from Australia, speaking how someone in Australia would speak, someone who has his background and his upbringing and his communication style and his method of thinking and making sense of things and expressing himself. And I see him doing that to Eastern Seaboard American, like totally different class upbringing, experiences, social strata, social norms, political correctness, etc., etc. And it's like kind of like War of the Worlds, right? It's like it's Alien. I'm sorry, like as soon as I saw that, I was like, oh, there's like Julian being a Julian. And there's like 2 women who want to make Julian something that Julian is not because they want to achieve political ends as a result of it.
Yeah.
This is oil and water. And all I could think to myself is, if you can't, if you are so affronted and so insulted by Julian speaking like so frankly, like anybody would from Australia and New Zealand, like we're very straightforward people.
Yeah,
we're very blunt. This is what we think. This is what we, just very, what you see is what you get. There's not, it's not contrived. Julian is not a contrived person. Like Julian is not affecting a different personality for these different people. He is who he is. And when I saw that scene and I saw, the reaction of the press, all I thought to myself, honestly, is, my God, you would not last 5 minutes in a pub in Sydney. Like you would run screaming. If you think, coming from where I come from and the environment that I come from, which is similar enough to Julian and his environment, I mean, I'm sorry, at some point you've got to be a little bit more open-minded and down-to-earth and realistic, and not so like wanting to homogenize the entire world into your method of communication because that gives a better impression of yourself or of someone else. I mean, we don't have, this life is too short. This life is too short to live eternally curtailed by the expectations of others. And that's another thing that ties into what I was saying before when I said to you in the context of Julian bravely taking on new topics or new areas of conversation with no care in the world as for what people would think about it. It ties back into exactly this. Hey, Julian is not here to apologize to people.
Mm-hmm.
But, and it's not like an empathy. He's an incredibly empathetic person. You have to be an empath to do the things that he does, to care about people who are being bombed, to care about saving an at-risk journalist, to care about seizing back narrative control from warmongering governments. You have to be an empathic person to do this. It's not at all that he has some callous disregard, but it's actually an honesty. It's an authenticity. And that authenticity is so special and so rare, and I don't want to think that we should ever aspire to having people tell us, oh, you need to be this, you need to be that, you need to say this, you need to say that. No, we need to be ourselves. We need to be authentic, and we need to be principled, and we need to be brave. And political correctness is not about those things at all. In fact, it's the opposite.
Yeah, and I think thankfully that's starting to change now. But yeah, I completely agree with you.
There's an inevitable backlash.
Yeah, and so I think that was the point I was actually trying to get at, which you elucidated much better. But I think at the time when that scene came out, it was sort of in the height of that political correctness, and I think looking back at it now, it's really interesting to watch, because it's like, Julian was right all along about this political correctness and how to kind of, it had nothing to do with his attitude to women or all these things. All right, so just kind of wanted to shift it across to your current situation and how you got to this situation. Can you just sort of kind of talk people through, from the moment you decided you had to leave and what that whole process was like?
Sure. So, like I said, I was staring another 3 years minimum in the face of a really tyrannical regime, literally, in New Zealand. I mean, the then Prime Minister of New Zealand, John Key, was an ex-member of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He was the head of derivatives trading for Morgan Stanley. He Merrill Lynch, actually, not Morgan Stanley, for Merrill Lynch. He was also the self-elected minister in charge of the security services in New Zealand, and he, in that same year, 2014, his office had been revealed in a groundbreaking book by New Zealand investigative journalist Nikki Hager, a book called Dirty Politics, to have been involved in targeting dozens of journalists in New Zealand and others. And so I was staring in the face, having to continue trying to stay in one piece, and while doing my journalism under that regime, or to leave and hope that the targeting of me would stop. And so I took legal advice, and it was suggested to me that I knew I was good to leave in terms of whether I technically could. And so I packed up and left the country. We went to stay with friends of mine in Malaysia for a little while. We went to Hong Kong and then to Malaysia, and then we went to Germany. So at the time, Germany was considered to be a much safer place, somewhat of a haven for tech activists and journalists, and the whistleblower community as a whole. And so I had really high hopes that if I left New Zealand, that I would leave the targeting of me behind. Unfortunately, I was wrong, and that didn't happen. The types of targeting and nature of the targeting that I experienced in each country I went to was a little bit different. When I first arrived in Hong Kong, having left New Zealand, I got to my hotel with my children. I opened my son's suitcase, and there was box cutter blades left sitting in the top of my son's suitcase on top of his clothes, just in plain sight the second that I opened the suitcase. So that was my first really nasty reminder that, oh, we have left, but the targeting is following us, and we were followed on foot. We had surveillance teams follow us around Hong Kong while we were there. I went to Malaysia. In Malaysia, I was having pretty severe technical interference. I didn't have any physical threats in Malaysia, but I was being followed around by teams on the ground. And I was being, in both Hong Kong and Malaysia, I was being photographed when I was out in public, which is something that happened to me regularly in New Zealand. And there was interference with my devices and with my communications. When I went to Germany, I was really, really hoping that it was going to stop the targeting of me, but the targeting of me in Germany was almost the same as in New Zealand. I didn't have the severe incidents of dangerous happenings to my physical person. However, I had blacked out white surveillance van outside my house 24 hours a day in Berlin, the same as I did in New Zealand. I was constantly followed everywhere that I went. I was photographed, and my children were photographed in public everywhere that we went. I had incidents of 1 a.m. fire alarms and like us all emptying out onto the street with all the other residents of the building. And then coming back in eventually and discovering cigarette lighters left on my children's pillows on their beds. Things like this, like just this type of, yet again, the intrusions into our personal space, the break-ins, et cetera. I pretty much like grinned and bared it and just continued doing my activism in journalism. But the longer I was in Berlin and the more things that I got involved in there, for example, I started covering major, huge TTIP rallies that were happening. Like there was 250,000 people. At this time I was reporting for Mint Press News, doing live event coverage and also analysis of issues relating to Snowden files, the Section 702 findings and court proceedings, etc. The targeting started to increase in severity again. I was having constant harassment. I was having the sounds of power drills on the other side of my bedroom wall day and night, and my building managers saying, no, there's no construction, no, there's no power drills, but here I am making audio recordings of this constant noise pollution in my personal space, and no one could explain what was happening or do anything about it. And then for me, the final straw in Germany was when they started coming at me through my children's school, and they started to make false accusations against me, which fortunately I had great legal support there and was able to push back against. But they were making very clear threats to my custody of my children. And in the context of, my work. And for me, that was like the red line. I was like, okay, this is beyond a joke. Like, I can't live peacefully here. I can't live without being targeted here. I have to leave the NATO bloc. I have to get out of the Western European sphere. And so we came into Eastern Europe, and for the first time since 2011, the targeting of me stopped. Just stopped. No one photographing me, no one following me, no one breaking into my house, no one tampering with my stuff, no crazy sounds of power drills, no surveillance vans outside my house, like all for the first time in at that point 5 years. The targeting of me stopped, and I was able to, it actually took me about 6 months of being in Russia to be able to breathe again. Like, because at first when it stops like that, when you go through this experience of like having been so heavily targeted and then the targeting completely ceasing, at first you just expect, it could happen again, and like maybe tomorrow it will start again, maybe next week it will start again. Like, you can't allow yourself to actually believe that it's not happening anymore. And so it took me about 6 months to go, wow, like I actually am safe here.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I actually am not being targeted. And so, unfortunately, at the same time in New Zealand, more information was coming out about other people who had been targeted and the severity of that. We know from Snowden files that were released around that time period that one of the 88 people who were targeted by the GCSB had their passport cancelled, had their house raided and the passport cancelled, was prevented from travelling. At the same time, the New Zealand government were passing new legislation specifically to allow them to more easily and more secretly cancel the passports of New Zealand citizens who were considered a threat to national security. At the same time, the New Zealand police made a public statement deeming one of the movements that I was a co-founder of the hashtag of and very involved in, actually officially named us as being a threat to national security. All of the security legislation that was being passed was invoking this threat to national security brand. And at the same time, then the New Zealand cabinet, or the New Zealand cabinet ministers, actually, they had a cabinet paper tabled and they were eventually successful, to remove the legal definition of the term threat to national security. So I was being confronted with being labelled a threat to national security, with legislation being passed to revoke the passports of threats to national security, and at the same time the legal definition of threat to national security being eradicated from the books, and it therefore being at the determination of government officials as to what any given threat to national security actually constituted.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that context, I took all of that information to lawyers in Russia and said, this is my situation, what do I do?
Mm-hmm.
And they said, if you travel outside of Russia, if you and the kids travel outside of Russia and the New Zealand government cancels your passports, you will be in a legal no man's zone. You will be in limbo, and there will not be anybody able to assist you. And my Russian lawyer literally said, do not travel.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the point at which I took that advice very seriously, and I applied for temporary asylum in Russia.
Mm-hmm. So, and what's your current kind of situation?
So, unfortunately for me, when you, and certainly in Julian's case and also in Ed Snowden's case, prior to making an application for temporary asylum, you are supposed to register with the UNHCR as a refugee and obtain refugee status. And then subsequently, you make your application for asylum. Now, very interestingly, and in those cases, for example, Edward Snowden got refugee status granted to him in Hong Kong before he traveled to Russia. So when he applied for asylum in Russia, he already had refugee status.
Mm-hmm.
Julian likewise had gotten refugee status and then applied for asylum. I went to UNHCR here in Russia and applied for refugee status, and I was seen by, my case file was reviewed by the executive director, the top person at the UNHCR agent registered UNHCR agent in Moscow, and she refused to process my refugee application. She refused to accept it, and she refused to deny it. And the basis under which she refused to accept or deny it was because, and she literally said this to myself and my lawyer, she does not like Julian Assange because Julian Assange had published details of her meetings with the US ambassador in Cablegate. Mm-hmm. And I was thoroughly shocked by this because, of course, my hundreds of pages of evidence for my application for refugee status had WikiLeaks references all the way through it, and had references to Julian all the way through it, because there were several dozen examples by then of WikiLeaks having shared my work, and it's very obvious to everybody the severity of the targeting of WikiLeaks and Julian, and how that could also have a flow-on effect to me in my reporting and in my body of work and my area of expertise. And so I came home from that meeting without refugee status, and I typed the woman's name into wikileaks.org, and I discovered over 100 references to her in Chelsea Manning's Cablegate reporting. So that left me with a real problem, which is that I needed to apply for asylum, but I didn't have refugee status. So, of course, we did try and appeal, and we got referred back to the same woman at the same Moscow office. We actually did go and see her a second time, and we still were unable to obtain refugee status. We were unable to, we couldn't obtain a denial of it or an accept or an approval of it. So that forced me to apply for asylum without having had refugee status granted. And then that meant that it put me down a completely different legal pathway, because I'm now no longer under UNHCR and under international law, but actually going through domestically. And it's just dramatically complicated the process for me. And ultimately, without that refugee status, it's highly unlikely that I will be able to obtain the asylum that I need. So that's a part of why recently a team of my activists and I have launched the Protect Suzie campaign, which you can read about at protectsuzie.com, where we are now having to appeal to international bodies and to the UN writ large, UNHQ, to intervene in my case and to grant me the emergency refugee status that I need in order to be able to reapply for asylum as a refugee. And I need them to acknowledge the mountain of evidence that I have been politically persecuted for my activism and my journalism, and that I require protection. And so we have high hopes that they'll do that, provided that there is enough public interest and public support. So there is now an open letter that is published and that people have been signing. There's already 400 something signatures, which is not bad for how long it's been up there. We're asking people to please go to protectsuzie.com/open letter and to sign that open letter, calling for international bodies and NGOs to support me and intervene in our case in order to help us to obtain refugee status, and so that I can then reapply for asylum.
Yeah, and I would completely urge everyone to do that if they can. Have you had any kind of, have you made any progress with anyone at the United Nations in terms of people outside of this woman?
Right, so she isn't actually with the United Nations. How it works is that UNHCR has registered agents, in various locations where there isn't actually like a UN office or whatever. And so that's how it came about, that this woman who is the head of this registered agent, which is actually a separate entity, but that represents UNHCR here in Moscow, was able to effectively sabotage my process. So no, I don't want to go too much into like current endeavors and current plans, like in terms of what lawyers are doing and what we're planning to do, but just to say that the more people who sign the open letter, the more people who are willing to say, it's actually not okay that this journalist and her family have been so negatively impacted by political persecution, maliciously undertaken in retribution for lawful activities, for important lawful activities, for truth-telling journalism and activism, legal democratic activism in the public, defending the public right to know. That's not okay, and that therefore we need the international community to step up and to intervene and to protect us.
Yeah, I think it's kind of part of this wider trend of, the more truthful the journalism is, the more severely it's punished at the moment. And I think cases like yours and Julian's are kind of prime examples of that, of, the reporting that both of you have done is, increased the public's understanding of so many things that we would have probably never really known about if it wasn't for people like you. And then you guys should be sort of praised and people should be, shouting your names out to the rooftops, but it's the complete opposite. So I think that's why, I would 100% urge people to go to protectsuzie.com to support you. What are your thoughts on kind of the current overall sort of geopolitical situation, or the situation in the West and freedom of speech? Do you have any thoughts on that?
What I see at the moment is many examples of the covert becoming overt.
Mm-hmm.
They seem to be more and more blatant about what they do, more and more blatant in their abuses, almost to the point where they're almost promoting them. I mean, the treatment of Julian is so egregious, and it really makes a mockery of democracy. It makes a mockery of terms like press freedom. That's what I mean about it being so blatant. Like the UK holding a press freedom event, like not 2 or 3 kilometers away from where Julian was trapped in the embassy.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like there's no effort anymore to cover it up. Like appointing judges that are connected to, or are married to a defense contractor. Like it's just the conflicts of interest, the abusive legal process,
Mm-hmm.
are just so abundantly blatant.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we see the same thing in New Zealand. So, for example, in New Zealand in 2018, there was a groundbreaking State Services Commission report into the targeting of New Zealand citizens by private intelligence companies in New Zealand. Specifically, the exact same company that I had been naming since 2012 as having targeted us is the company confirmed by the 2018 State Services Commission report to have been hired by up to a dozen government departments to target New Zealanders, to target journalists, to target activists, to target Internet Party, Kim Dotcom's political party, with which I was leader in the 2017 campaign and which I was supporting and promoting in 2014. That report resulted in a referral to the New Zealand police to investigate their subcontracting private intelligence company for their crimes and for their abuses. And the police accepted that referral from the State Services Commissioner and were supposed to launch an investigation. 3 months later, New Zealand journalists went to the police and said, "What's the progress with this investigation? What have you unearthed? What are you doing about these abuses of New Zealand citizens?" And the New Zealand police said, "We forgot to start the investigation." And literally the headline, like one of the biggest news outlets in New Zealand, top NZ cop says, "We forgot to start the investigation." And Thomson Clark Intelligence Limited, this private intelligence company hired by the government. Fast forward another 3 months and they ask again of the police, what are you doing about this? And they say, "Oh, we've decided not to continue the investigation."
Mm-hmm.
So this is the environment we live in, is one where there is complete disregard for legal judicial process,
Mm-hmm.
rampant corruption in the police and prosecutorial services, and no avenues for redress.
Mm-hmm.
Literally no avenues for redress.
Mm-hmm.
The corruption is just wide open for everyone to see, and it is very disheartening in that regard. The upside of it, I guess, is that there is increasing support for people like Julian.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very gratified to see the change in the social environment, political environment, in terms of it has become much more popular. It has become much more acceptable to take public stance in support of Julian in 2018, 19 and 20 by comparison to 2016 and 2017. And that was something that we really hoped to bring about and manifest with efforts like the Unity for J campaign. So I'm very, very pleased to see that happening. there are now actions for Julian around the world on nearly a daily basis. They're almost constant, and often they're simultaneous in multiple locations. And we've seen big shifts in the political sphere, particularly in Australia, with, I think they had like about 10 MPs or ex-MPs currently engaged in a political action committee advocating for Julian. So at a public level, I think people are more awake and more active and more aware, and that's a very, very good thing. But at a state, at a governmental level, at an agency level, the corruption is worse and more blatant and more out in the open than ever before.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I guess the saving grace of that potentially is that corruption has got so bad that it's not just about Julian anymore. It kind of spans across so many different fields that even if you were someone that didn't particularly, have much interest in Julian's case, you're starting to have things in common, because you care about another issue. Because I think all of these things seem to be related in terms of, Syria, Jeffrey Epstein, Hillary Clinton, all these, I think all these stories are interlinked in terms of what I believe is it's the kind of intelligence community and the military industrial complex and all the contracting firms. And it's just what you mentioned with the profit incentive in the surveillance, but I think it's not just in surveillance. I think you'll have that same thing with just, with military contractors and so on. The profit and short-term gain has kind of become more important than the values of the West and democracy and freedom of speech. So you're starting to see this corruption at a multitude of levels, which is obviously not a good thing, but I think it's making a lot more people aware of what's going on and how bad it's getting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I see too, and with my own situation, my own experiences, I have been surprised by the amount of public support that I have gotten so far. I have wonderful people reaching out to me and saying, "Are you okay? Can we help you? We want to support you." Just normal, everyday people. And yet, I have over the years been totally stonewalled by organizations whose charters and funding are supposed to be to support people who are like me. And so that says a lot about regular people in the society, that they actually do have good hearts and they do see that something's wrong and they do want to do something about it. And us good regular people are going to have to band together and really lobby the NGOs and the big organizations to take a stand and to care. And to intervene and do what they are supposed to do. And I'm hopeful that we will see that in my case. I mean, I am at risk of detention. I'm at risk of deportation as per my current status. I'm engaged in a ongoing legal process, an appeals process, but frankly and honestly speaking, I am at risk of being the next person to be silenced, of not being able to report anymore, of not being able to tweet, not being able to communicate with activists and support activists. So it will take some type of meaningful intervention on the parts of conscientious people within organizations able to provide that type of support to change that outcome for me, because as things stand, there's no Julian Assange that I know of who has the guts and the balls to throw their weight around in the public arena and make it happen. And that's one of the most saddening things for me, not just in my own case, but it saddens me that for all the lives that Julian saved, the jailing of him, the containing of him, the degrading of him robs future whistleblowers, sources, at-risk journalists and publishers of of his intervention and his support and his advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a real crime. It's
Yeah.
not just Julian's one life, but it's all of the other lives that he would have touched and would have saved and would have positively impacted. And I mean, that said, I'm actually still hopeful. I'm still hopeful that I saw many times with WikiLeaks and observing WikiLeaks across this decade that at times where it seemed the absolute darkest and it seemed like, oh my God, what is going to happen to Julian? What's going to happen to WikiLeaks? Something would break, and it's like it was darkest before the dawn. Something would break, something would happen, and it would breathe new life back. And I mean, we saw that this year when WikiLeaks started publishing again. That was a huge moment for me. That was something that I was just absolutely ecstatic about. That despite everything that was done to Julian, they have not been able to kill his baby.
Mm-hmm.
They've not been able to stop the work, and the others still do rise in place to pick up that torch and run with it.
Mm-hmm. And I think, I think there are positive signs for Julian, hopefully, with, I think, this kind of Russiagate scandal. Obviously, WikiLeaks is kind of a central part of that, and it, obviously it had nothing to do with Russian intelligence agencies and so on. But, there's several lawsuits going on in the United States about, these things. And I think all these things will kind of help in the favor of WikiLeaks. And I guess
the truth will out. The truth will out.
Yeah, it will. And it always does. And I think that's our saving grace in these situations. And I guess just to go back to your point about Julian, he's always been there for every other journalist or everyone else, and just kind of the public in general. He's always kind of been looking out for people in terms of spying and government corruption. So I think it's kind of the least that everyone could do now is that he's the one that's in trouble. So all of us should be banding together for him and for you and for other people that have done courageous reporting and all that have whistleblown from intelligence agencies. But yeah, so thanks very much for the chat. And hopefully everything kind of gets sorted out pretty soon.
I'm really lucky to have had some pretty amazing advocates. I mean, if you when people go to protectsuzie.com, they'll see that I'm so blessed to have had Christine Assange wrote a proper notarized legal letter in support of me in my case. John Kiriakou, the ex-CIA torture whistleblower, also has advocated for me in the same format. So is Kim.com, my good friend and the founder of Internet Party, and a number of others. There's eyewitness testimony. There's all kinds of information on their website, and a simple signature on that open letter really could make the difference for me in terms of being able to generate some type of intervention. So thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about all of this.
Yeah, no worries, and we'll talk again soon.